I'm Denise Bennetts, a founder of Bennetts Associates Architects and the chair of the RIBA Awards Group. Welcome to the Building Stories Talks, where we look at RIBA award-winning projects and invite the architects to share the stories behind their buildings. We can all learn from seeing the innovation, careful thought, and hard work that goes into these projects, whatever their scale. So, thank you for joining the first in the second series of Building Stories, the lunchtime talks where we celebrate the 2022 RIBA award-winning projects. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Tom Miller of Haysom Ward Miller Architects and Will Gamble of Will Gamble Architects. And they're going to talk about their work on two private homes which involve the reworking of existing buildings. Tom will be talking about Suffolk Cottage in Suffolk and Will the Parchment works in the East Midlands area. Before we pass over to the talks, please remember to send in your questions at any time on the Q&A in the chat, and we can pick them up later. So now, Suffolk Cottage is the architect's family home. It's crafted with modest resources and a degree of self-build from a 19th century farm worker's cottage. It meets exemplary sustainability standards, with the energy in use being a fraction of that of most modern homes and getting very close to the blue ribbon standard passive house. I visited the house, and it actually is a delightful sequence of spaces and volumes, and the link to the countryside is fantastic. So as well as winning an RIBA East Award, it won an RIBA National Award. So I'm delighted to hand over to Tom and to ask him to actually just take you through the delightful project. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Denise. That's a lovely introduction. As Denise says, this is very much our own house, and it's got the usual compromises that are inevitable with any personal project. Liz, my wife, and I have always bought wrecks. We've always worked on things. Obviously makes fun to go further. This is a previous one where we tried all sorts of things like clay lump repairs, clay rendering, breathing floors, that kind of thing. And there was actually a bit of brick extension there that we were able to build around, keeping the original brickwork to give a bit of thermal mass and rigidity, but putting an insulated jacket around it. So it's a chance to try out ideas, minimal foundations there. Anyway, we lived there for 15 or so years. Our daughters were growing up. We were looking out for another project. And this one came up. It was in the national press, and it was a cottage we knew. It was just up the road. We'd pedalled past it many times. It was a typical sort of Suffolk plantsman's cottage. He was self-sufficient, a very no-nonsense attitude to garden biodiversity. And this was the chap who lived there, Gerald Mays. He'd moved there as a toddler when his parents had taken on the tenancy in the 1930s, standing here by the front door of the cottage. He was now in his 80s. And basically, this is what it looked like when we pedalled up there. It had all become a bit much for him to look after. He'd taken to feeding the mice as his friends in the evenings. And he'd had to move out. And inside, it was very, very basic. Just 1.5 rooms on each floor, essentially, in the cottage. And absolutely tiny. Flint walls, no foundations. Structurally, it was struggling a bit. You can see it really was very, very basic and in a bit of a state. What was interesting about it for us was its site as much as anything. It was obviously a pretty little house, but it was on this long, very shallow site that ran parallel to the road. And to the south, although there were no windows at all looking in that direction, fairly typically, plant and farmers, when they come in, they don't necessarily want to stand and look at the fields. But behind it was a bank and then just farmland as far as you could see. And I think we thought that if we could somehow turn the house around, it was rescuable. I think most people looking at the site probably assumed they'd be demolishing it. But we wrote to the owners, the landlords, the family who owned it all that time here in the village, and said we would like to try to keep it. And I think there is some value in that. There's a community memory of the people who've lived in a building. This is still Gerald's cottage as far as a lot of the villages are concerned. Karen Polwart has written a song about buildings being etched with the memories of the people who've lived there. I think that's perhaps a bit spiritual for me, but I think we all know what she means. And then there's the more prosaic things about embodied energy. There's a lump of building there that's useful. If it can be saved, why not? And finally, there's obviously a trend everywhere for the generic, the global solution. And there's so much more interest to be had if we can keep the idiosyncratic, the unique, especially a building like this, which is so much a product of the land around it. Quite literally, it's made out of the ground that it stands on. And it's that gives things interest. So we had to decide what to do with this cottage. As I say, it didn't have any windows looking out to the south. It had this bank just behind it. But we felt that by perhaps adding a second two-story element that would echo perhaps the form and scale of the original building, we'd then still have room to slip a bit of building behind between the cottage and the field. And that could give us the space that we would need to house the four of us and make the most of the site. And we also obviously wanted to try to build in a bit of flexibility as the children grew up and left home. So we started to think about this sequence that would involve moving in through the cottage, which is relatively introspective, passing through into an extension that would take in views of the farmland to the south. And then, because you're already up half a level, giving you the scope to perhaps link quite directly to the first floor of the cottage, which could be a cozier evening extension of the main living space. Looking at the plan in a bit more detail, I'll do only briefly because plans are only interest to some people, I know. There's the cottage bottom left in the main block, given over entirely to entrance space, which is absolute boon, obviously, in the countryside where you've got boots, dogs, goats, all the rest of it. Then passing through the back of that into this space that's dominated by the farmland behind. The ground floor of the extension, we decided we could give over to our two daughters. And talking it over with them, they were willing to go for slightly smaller than usual bedrooms, little compact cabins, but that would then leave them with enough space for a studio workspace and their own shower and their own entrance. And clearly that would build in some adaptability for us because it could become a sort of self-enclosed lodgers accommodation when they move out. Then upstairs, as I say, we could fit in a music room in the roof space of that extension, and we could devote the upstairs of the cottage to our own bedroom. Obviously, our teenagers, you don't want to be too close to our kids, and probably they don't want to be too close to us. Looking at the section, that business of moving up the half level meant that we then had to pop up part of the bedroom, but by doing that, we could get a bed platform that looked out over the extension to the farmland behind. Quite important for us. I do love not having to get up early on a Sunday. And moving through the middle of the building, you can see their studio tucks in just in front of the living space, but uses the change of level to get some more interesting section. The thermal strategy of the building, we decided the best way to deal with it, because we want to change the original appearance of the outside, was to insert a timber-framed insulated airtight box. And then for the extension, we sort of reversed that. We put up a timber frame structure, which would then wrap with an airtight layer, insulation, weatherproof layer. So each of those then consistent in itself and allowing good continuity. In retrospect, we were building in slight difficulties by obviously managing that junction between the two different strategies, particularly as you tend to be abutting a porous flint wall at that point. Structurally, as I say, the cottage needed help. The new slab inside was towed out underneath the walls to help support them. And the box could pick up the roof loads as well, which meant we could take out the ceiling and get more headroom upstairs. And then the extension would buttress the south and west sides by including some masonry fins within its timber frame. Although I think the strategy was good, as the building started to settle onto its new foundation, this flint is so weak. Flint masonry really is just a pile of marbles, as one of my colleagues has said. It did start to crack, and we did have to add a steel belt going around the waist of the old cottage, bolted back to the floor plate of the box inside. One of the key points as we started about the actual construction of this was that we decided not to tender the work. We thought we'd work with a builder that we knew and we trusted, and that way we could avoid the cost of the tender, which is obviously there, of course. And it meant, more importantly, we could start talking to him early about the materials he had left over. There's so much waste in construction. We knew that he, like most builders, had all sorts of stuff in his yard that was no longer required. And if we could use that, we'd be dealing with some waste materials, but it would be cheaper as well. And he ended up contributing a lot of the brick and some flint blocks and things that we have here, all of which would have gone for crushing otherwise. The downside of choosing him was that he's not a specialist. So we knew from the outset we'd have to keep the details and materials simple and conventional. And also we wouldn't have a fixed price. So we'd just have an open book and a clear idea of our budget, which is a bit worrying when you've got a building that is really quite mobile. There's a lot of shoring. And in fact, that panel of flint above the window started to detach quite early on as we got it onto its new foundations. Still, we got on with construction, clearing around the sort of lean-tos and starting to build the new part. That's the south extension up on its extra half level. And once we got that bit of extra stability around the building, we could start to clear out inside, which we did completely all the way up to the roof, allowing us to manage much better air tightness and thermal continuity. Timber frame of the main extension, you can see one of those masonry buttressing fins there. And then, because funds were limited, once we got a weather-tight envelope, I was able to get inside and start work on the internal joinery, kitchens, bathrooms, toilet boxings, that kind of thing. Liz and I were line pointing and slobbering that flint wall you can see to the left there, which is the outside wall of the old cottage, to try to minimise air leakage. And then as they got into first fix, I could start installing things. But funds did run out, inevitably, as we knew they would. And this is the stage it was at when we moved in. We managed to get the girls' end plastered, wired, so they had lights and power. We had a bathroom. But the cottage was still just at the tack stage. The dogs obviously didn't like it very much. We've worked on it ever since, a couple of years' work, and we're getting to this stage. And we had a house that was starting to be quite comfortable. Inevitably, there are a lot of compromises for budget and our own limited skill. But it's the real world, it's not high architecture. So this is the entrance. You can see that steel belt around the cottage there. That's the original door that Gerald was standing next to as a young lad. I've actually finished pointing around that door now, so it looks slightly better. And as you get into the house, that's the entrance hall within the cottage, the original brick floor, which we lifted so it could be relaid after it had been insulated. And steps up there that take you through into the extension, where you suddenly get these big views out to the countryside behind. And it's actually dominated by the farmland beyond, and the farming year, the plough, drill, tend, harvest schedule. And the residents, we've got muntjac commuting back and forth daily, hares chasing each other in spring. Our buzzards, we think are very proprietorily nesting in the trees just off to the left. Absolutely just in touching distance. As you move through the main space, you can see that we've got it a bit further than it was when we first moved in. There's obviously a nod there to the arts and crafts. You've got a main space, but then a series of niches off it that allow for different activities of the family and create spaces of slightly different character within that. Down at the kitchen end, I built the kitchen, ply. It's got bamboo fronts and top, which are all quite economical. And you get the external wall of the cottage there revealed. Now it's been lime mortared. And moving back down the other end of the house, as you go out beyond, we've got a sort of terrace or an outdoor room. I had to hunt around a bit for those PVs because we wanted glass-backed ones to get the dappled light down onto the terrace below. And if you go upstairs in the extension at that point, you've got the music room, which serves as an evening space and as Liz's office, but also as a guest room. There's a fold-out bed within that boxing. Back down at the cottage end, it is tiny, and we knew we couldn't get in a bathroom or anything like that. But again, going back to the strategy of niches, we could build in things around the edge of the wall where headroom was limited. And the space winds around the retained chimney breast and then climbs up to the bed space, which has those fantastic views out over the countryside beyond. Those tiles, I think, are another find, another reuse. We knew there were undyed wool floor tiles out there somewhere. And I Googled and found a supplier. Couldn't afford them, but of course you just do a deep eBay search and eventually somewhere they come up. Now, I said at the beginning, we wanted the house to be energy efficient. That was important for us. We were spending money. It would seem a bit self-indulgent not to do as well as we could. So we did make an effort with air tightness, as I explained, with insulation. We spent the money on an air source heat pump. We went for a very basic MVHR small PV installation. And because the building's all electric, it's actually been quite straightforward to monitor the performance, and it's been really encouraging. The PV line is the green there, and the blue is the heat pump use. And although they're obviously out of phase seasonally, you can see that even a small PV installation for a house like this can provide 60 or 70% of the energy needed by the heat pump. And even with the additional unregulated energy that we need for cooking and so on, we're still coming in almost exactly on the RIBA 2030 target, and miles better than most housing that gets built these days. And comparing with passive house, clearly we're nowhere near passive house. Well, we're not a million miles off. We're not quite hitting it, but we are miles clear of even modern average British domestic construction. And I think that was really satisfying. We want to demonstrate that it's achievable, this kind of level of performance, without a huge amount of effort. It just takes little care. And we really need to get used to this idea that decent energy performance isn't just a superpower for a few specialist buildings. It can be the default, and it should be a given. You know, it shouldn't be a necessary matter of discussion because it's just assumed. So even, you know, this floored building with naturally air leaky flint walls has achieved you know, really quite impressive performance, and it is doable. Anyway, that's a very brief run through. Concentrated very much on the story of the build because it's our own personal house. I suppose that's inevitable. But obviously, if there are any questions about technical aspects or anything else, I'm happy to answer them.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, so please keep on bringing them in. But before we get to them, I've got one question myself. I love the expression you used about community memory. And I just wondered, was there any kind of building memory that you decided that you wanted to capitalize or to play against in terms of the relationship of the mix of the new and the old that you've got? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about is a kind of almost like the compression. I mean, the entrance looks incredibly light in the photographs, and it is light, but it's quite a tight space. So it's got that kind of feeling of compression before you then go into the new build extension. And then you've got, you know, the original was pretty orthogonal, but you actually introduced the curves in the horizontal in terms of planning the bedroom. And then, of course, the music room has got that
section as
beautiful
well.
Section. So I just wondered if you'd like to perhaps talk about those.
Yes, I mean, it is difficult, inevitably, in improving thermal performance. You do lose the building either inside or outside to some extent. And we had to think about where we would keep it, where we would hint at it, where we'd reflect the original layout. There isn't a lot of the layout left, but you still get the order of that central stack, which is obviously one of the main ordering principles in any small cottage. And then there are elements in the materials that we reused. You know, I said that the front door, I probably didn't say, the front door, although it's still there, you know, I took it off, I insulated it, I beefed it up, but I was able to use material that was on doors elsewhere in the building. And so they're all still there, and you've got fragments of the old paints, the old wallpapers, just here and there, that do give that memory. But a lot of it is just, I say, it's just community memory. You know, people walking past, they see it and they come out with stories about Gerald. And I know Liz went to see him. He went into a residential home, and she was able to talk to him about what we were doing, and his family were able to show us the pictures of what it was like before. And so it does live on in that sense. He's not around anymore, I'm afraid. But you know, at least it's still here, and it was such a big part of his life for so long. I do think that's important.
Right, that almost leads us on to a question from Izzy F, asking, what was the planning permission process like for the project?
Weirdly easy. I think because we weren't planning to knock it down, when we went to the planners and said, we're looking at doing quite a big extension, it was only 30 or 40 square meters, the original cottage. And I think they knew that it just couldn't survive like that. The fact we were willing to work with the structure and that it would stand, it is quite an object on this lane. You know, everyone knows it stands there on its own. I think they were happy that we were doing that and we weren't going to try to dominate it. And they were incredibly positive. Yeah.
Good. Then we've got Joe asking, was the internal timber frame designed by structural engineers to restrain the flint walls, and or prefabricated or made by you to suit the site and the fit?
Very much stick built. You know, if you're using a small builder, it's the cheaper way to go, and they know how to do it. So yeah, the engineer just made sure that it was designed to be stable and to give the stability by using sheathing things to make it stiff enough, and in the floor plate as well.
Right. And then Rebecca's asking, she's saying how much she thinks it looks absolutely lovely, and just wants to know if you'd like to expand on any issues you found whilst renovating certain areas of the cottage.
Oh, so many. Every time you open up anything to do anything, you always find it's not as you expect. And I think we're still finding that. You know, we've still got a well to deal with and things like that. And you know that it's very poor construction. You know, we've got issues with the bees that live in the walls, the hornets that live in the chimney, the mice that will always find a way through the masonry. You just have to go with that kind of thing. It's an old building, and you've got to not be too squeamish about it.
Which almost inevitably takes us on to a question from James, just saying, if you were to do it again, is there anything you would do differently?
Technically, probably not. You know, I'm happy to compromise on things in order to get the building that we've got. The one thing I would change, my mother became a wheelchair user during the time we were doing the build, and she's obviously visited a few times, and it really brings home to you how important accessibility is in a house, and how it's very hard with existing buildings. You know, they've often gathered different levels and things over their lifetimes, but if I was doing it differently, I would have tried to make it more accessible. And I think that's something I always think about now in all the work I'm doing. Sometimes you need personal experience of it to drive that lesson home.
Yes, I think it is actually one of those aspects which we will be including in RIBA awards going forward, especially for private houses, is that it's very easy to make decisions, but it's also just future-proofing. So,
yeah.
you know,
well, change the level is such a great tool architecturally. You can achieve so much to change the level. But they do make life very difficult for people.
As long as you can circumnavigate them, and that is the issue. And it's not necessarily, clearly we have to consider people with longer term disabilities, but, you know, even if you've got a child who goes playing sport and breaks a leg, you know, suddenly you're up against it. You have touched upon the heat pump, but Emily's asking, how are you heating and cooling the property, and did you have high sustainability goals for the build and life cycle?
As I said, I think for the build, we did our best with the budget we had available. You know, it would have been lovely to be using wood fibre insulations and things like that, which we did on our previous cottage, where we had clay lump and there was really no choice. Here we had to go for cheaper high performance insulants because that was the way we could get the thermal performance for our budget. It's all electric heating. We don't have any cooling. There's plenty of thermal mass. We thought we'd need more shading over the south windows, but we couldn't afford them at the time, so that was postponed. And in fact, living here, it hasn't been disastrous. We can rig up awnings on those odd days when it's very hot, but the rest of the year, the solar gain is great. So we did have high goals, but we didn't want it to dominate the whole scheme. You know, there's a lot of other things we wanted to achieve as well. And I kind of think if we can get good performance and do those other things as well, that's I think really promising.
Absolutely. And then a final question before we move on to Will is from Laura. And she says, you might not want to answer. She said, if you don't mind revealing, what was the total land and construction cost?
I can't remember what our original bid was on the land exactly. I know the construction cost was around 300,000 for 160 square metres. So, yeah, under £2,000 a square metre, which for southeast of England, fiddling around with an existing building and a decent level of thermal performance, I think, you know, we were pretty happy with. It's not got a small form factor either. You know, that's another thing that's perhaps a bit indulgent. So there's a lot of envelope to go in that budget. And
I think it is also the instance where, as you said, a lot of people looking at the site would have just demolished the building.
Yeah.
Whereas actually what you've done is, as you say, you've got the community memory and you've actually got a delightful family home. So,
and we do get people walking past, just stopping us when we're in the garden and saying that they're really pleased that it's still here and with what we've done. So,
Excellent. Right. I'll be asking Tom to join us again later, but I'd now like to move on to our next guest, Will Gamble, who's going to tell us about Parchment Works. So ostensibly, this is an extension to a Grade 2 listed double-fronted Victorian house, but it also incorporates the remnants of a cattle shed. And then just to add to the complication, it also has the ruined walls of a historic Parchment factory, which is a designated scheduled monument. So this project is for Will's parents. Again, I've been very lucky to have visited it. Fascinating project. And as well as getting a 2022 East Midlands and National RIBA Award, it got the East Midlands Award for Conservation and the Small Project of the Year. So Will, over to you. Looks as though we've got a slight technical glitch.
Hi there.
Great. Hello, Will. Over to you.
Right, thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Will. I'm director of Will Gamble Architects. We are a small studio of 5 people based in southwest London, and we predominantly focus on working with domestic architecture with a particular interest in working with historic buildings, where we like to combine contemporary interventions with heritage assets. Today, I'm going to talk to you about our Parchment Works project, which is the first significant project in our 4 to 5 year history. And as Denise mentioned, we were very fortunate to win a RIBA National Award and also shortlisted for the Stephen Lawrence Prize, which was a real honour and a humbling experience to be part of. The project is designed for my parents. It's situated in Northamptonshire, on the Northamptonshire-Rutland border. It's located towards the northern end of the village, and it's got amazing views down the Welland Valley to the west. The village is your typical quintessential English village. It's characterised by beautiful stone buildings with Collie Weston stone roofs, and the Parchment Works is no exception. This is its frontage along the high street. It's late Georgian, early Victorian, so very symmetrical in its proportions, and quite an attractive proposition along the street. However, towards the rear, it was a slightly different proposition. Attached to the back of the cottage was a cattle shed, and then beyond that, which you can see in the forefront of this image, a derelict parchment paper factory that had sadly fallen into disrepair. So yes, very disordered along the back. The whole structure itself was Grade 2 listed, and the parchment paper factory was in fact a scheduled monument and was once rumoured to make parchment paper for the royal family. So it carried with it quite a lot of historical significance, and as such was a real landmark amongst the local community, in particular the villagers. So a very sensitive project. This 3D massing study kind of gives you a general understanding of how the building was put together. Towards the back of the image, you can see the Victorian cottage, which addressed the high street. And at the forefront of this image, you can see the 16th century ruin, the parchment paper factory. And then sandwiched between the two of those buildings is the cattle shed. So it's a very linear building, quite modest from the front, but extends quite deep into the site, which is quite an attractive proposition. The client's initial brief was to convert the cattle shed, which was previously just ancillary storage space, into accommodation, and then demolish the ruin to make way for a brand new extension that would effectively occupy a similar footprint. Obviously, with the building's historical significance, demolishing a Grade 2 listed scheduled monument would have always been quite a challenging proposition, and in our opinion, completely the wrong thing to do. So we had to go down the long process of trying to persuade the client that actually retaining and celebrating the ruin was the right way to go. Eventually, they got on board for that process, and the project all became all about preservation through sustainable reuse. And conceptually, this was conceived as effectively inserting two lightweight glazed volumes within the historic walls of the ruin, and those glazed volumes needed to be lightweight, so that the architecture deliberately juxtaposed them so that the ruin walls could, in effect, be celebrated for generations to come. The first step in achieving that was to ascertain how structurally sound the ruin wall was. As you could see from the previous slide, it had fallen into disrepair and it had been exposed to the elements for some period of time. So we got a structural survey undertaken, and the results were promising. The walls to the ruin were structurally sound, and the foundations were surprisingly deep, predominantly due to the way the land sloped away down towards the site. Despite this, the structural engineer was still reluctant to put any additional load through the existing walls. So we had to come up with a concept whereby we'd effectively construct a building within a building. And that solution principle was quite simple, really. We cast a strip footing around the perimeter of the building to a depth that did not undermine the existing foundations. And then from that, we built a single skin of blockwork, which effectively formed the primary structure. And this drawing here, provided by the engineer, illustrates that strategy. So once we were clear that we could, in principle, achieve the concept that we were after, the next stage was how we restore and make good the walls above ground. The ruin walls were very much the essence of this project. So how we refurbished these was critical to the success of the scheme. About 10% of the stonework was defective. You can see on the left-hand side of this slide where the stone, because of the exposed nature of the site, had been damaged by freeze-thaw action, prevailing winds coming up the Welland Valley. So about 10% of the stonework needs to be chopped out and replaced with material to match. Fortunately, there were piles of rubble situated on the site from what we believe were smaller satellite buildings that used to form part of the Parchment works that had been demolished. And that meant the material that we could use was an exact match, which was really important to us. And there was also a sustainability strategy to that, because as I said before, the whole project was all about reuse. So once the defective material was replaced, we then had to go through the long process of raking out all the original lime mortar that had decayed and repointing it in lime mortar to match. So this is really important to us because we wanted to make sure that the colour of the lime mortar suited the patchwork of brick and stone that characterised the ruin. But also the lime mortar had to be soft enough so that it was sacrificial because of the exposed nature of the site. We did not want the stone to be decayed by the frost. Instead, we wanted the lime mortar to take the hit. So getting the blend of soft lime mix and the look was really important to us. And then the pointing style was really critical. We needed to make sure that we retained the textural quality of the ruin walls. So we went for a flush pointing style where we applied a heavy mix to the walls and brushed it back with a wire brush to expose the aggregate. And that allowed us to achieve or retain, the tectonic richness of the ruin walls, which was what this project was really all about. And this was sort of the end result after a lot of hard work. Internally, celebrating the ruin walls was just as important as celebrating them externally. And we sort of took the view that we wanted to minimize the amount of plasterboard as much as we possibly could so that we could effectively expose the structure and the historic fabric of the building. This applied to the walls as well as the roof structure itself. The stone walls, we specified 3 coats of lime wash to create a sort of a slightly more mottled effect, which created a really nice aesthetic, but also had the advantage of protecting the walls from everyday use of people occupying the building. and more importantly, allowed the walls to continue to breathe. This building had been exposed to the elements for some time now, so the walls were like sponges and effectively absorbed a huge amount of moisture over the years. So we needed that moisture to dissipate gradually over time, and covering them in modern day materials would never have allowed that to happen. In this image, you can see the old ceiling to the cattle shed in the forefront of the image. This ceiling was actually structurally unsound, taking the accommodation above. But in order to retain it, we effectively built a new structural deck over the top, which allowed us to keep it in situ. But also important thing to note here that obviously there was a discussion that needed to be happened with building control with regards to thermal performance of these walls. So we had to demonstrate to them that exposing the historic fabric of the building was a critical thing to the historical significance of this building. And instead we beefed up the floor build-up and the roof build-up in terms of thermal performance to offset the fact that we weren't insulating a majority of the external walls. The ruin walls did create many challenges. One of those challenges was the fact that they splayed at the base, like most historic walls do, and that meant running our finishes up to them in a sort of neat and tidy fashion was a challenge. So one of the ideas that we came up was to cast a monolithic skirting out of concrete, which ran around the perimeter of the building, which kind of added towards the tectonic richness of the walls, but also allowed us to run our floor finishes up to them in a neat and tidy fashion. The idea of enjoying the ruined walls internally and externally was such a key consideration for this project, but we also wanted the user to be able to occupy the space and look out onto the ruin as well. And we achieved this by pulling the extension back so that it didn't occupy the entire footprint of the ruin, which then allowed us to create an internal courtyard, which the building looked out onto. And then these floor-to-ceiling sliding doors, which are opened up quite often in the summer, means that the living space extends out into the ruin. Carrying the theme of sort of creating a contemporary intervention within the historic fabric of the building, sort of the juxtaposition between the two and how those sit alongside one another, we then took that into the interiors as well. So where we had joinery, we decided that this needed to be sort of contemporary in its appearance, with clean lines that sort of juxtapose the idiosyncratic nature of the ruined walls and the old ceilings that surround it. And then to push that concept even further, we sort of went for a very dark finish that contrasted that relationship. The island was built on a steel frame that was powder coated black, and there was a stainless steel top, and then it was embellished with bespoke brass handles. In terms of the layout of the building, as you can see from this ground floor plan, the front of the property, the double fronted section on the right of the plan, was left relatively untouched. A lot of the work obviously happened in the cattle shed and the ruin itself. But one of the key design principles from the very beginning was to create a line of sight as you walk through the front door, through the building and out towards the garden beyond, to exaggerate the unique linear nature of this building, and also to act as a timeline, because you through this line of sight you can really appreciate how the building has been phased over time. You can absorb yourself in the different sort of parts to it, the Victorian part, the cattle shed, and then the Parchment works itself. And this principle was then applied to the first floor too, so you can see that line of sight. And in each scenario, there's a picture window which frames views of the garden. Glazing was a really important part of this project, partly because, or mainly because, we wanted to make sure that these contemporary interventions were as lightweight as possible, so they did not detract from the ruined walls. So we needed a glazing supplier that we could work with collaboratively in order to come up with bespoke details that allowed us to achieve this and have a product that provided minimal sight lines. That glazing supplier was Maxlight. And here you can, on the right of this image, this slide, you can see an instance, quite a satisfying instance, where we chased the frame of the window into the ruined wall to allow a seamless flow from external to internal, where the ruined wall enters the space. Above the glazing is a ribbon of Corten steel. We chose this material because it's a gentle nod to the site's industrial past, being a relatively industrial material. We specified a 3 mil thick Corten shell that was fabricated by a local metal worker, literally 10 minutes down the road. On the right, you can see these being made in the warehouse, and then they were left in the yard for 3 months to rust and form that natural rusty patina that ends up protecting the material. What was important to us was that the long section of Corten had to be obviously fabricated in sections and welded together. Welding the metal actually denatures the material, so it means that it would effectively rust at a different rate. So we made sure that those weld joints lined through with the glazing bars below to create a more cohesive proposal. And then this is the last slide, and probably, well, the hero image of the project, but the reason why I want to talk about this slide is because in the forefront of this image is a historic stone bath, which we actually didn't know existed until we started excavating. And the reason why this slide is important is because this historic stone bath is fed by an underground stream that we discovered, which runs underneath the entire property. And that underground stream is a reason why the Parchment Works is situated in this particular location, because it provided a constant flow of fresh water that supplied the stone bath, and the skins of the animal hides would be strapped to the stone bath, and the flow of water would clean the skins, and then they would place them in the Parchment Works building itself to dry them out. So when we found this, the archaeologist in particular got very excited. So obviously we decided to leave it exposed and create a water feature out of it. And it now acts as, well, it now has a second use. It acts as an attenuation feature, capturing water from all the roofs of the main house. And it's used as an irrigation system during the summer. That's it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Will. Great way of actually presenting and explaining the building. I was glad you ended up on that final image, because it kind of leads into a question I've got before we go to the questions which have been coming in from members of the audience. So clearly the complexity of the conservation narrative was a big challenge. And of course, with hindsight, it kind of looks straightforward, possibly even simple. But I just want to know how many iterations and how long did it take going through the options for the scale and the articulation of the new volumes fitting in?
Yeah, so originally the brief actually was for a 2-story extension. Well, originally the brief was to knock the Parchment Works down and then do a 2-story extension. It then went to a 2-story extension sat within the ruin walls, which we presented to the local council, and was subsequently resisted. But I think it's a good example of the planning process working quite well, because to be honest, we were never comfortable with a 2-story extension. It was always something that the client wanted to do. So by going to a 1-story intervention, it was way more sympathetic, and it allowed us to achieve the ultimate goal, which was effectively preserving the ruin and allowing the ruin to do all the talking, in some respects, but in anti-architecture really. We were just adding something in there to make it habitable. So to put it, it took 1.5 years, nearly 2 years to get planning. So it wasn't an easy task, and we had to sell the idea hard to the local authority because it is quite a radical approach and probably something that they hadn't perhaps seen before. But eventually they got on board, and I'd like to think if the case officer walked around it or the conservation officer walked around it now, they would be happy with the end result.
Excellent. Well, perhaps we can pick up on that topic when Tom rejoins. But in the meantime, we've got some questions coming in for you, and I'm going to group some of them together. Yep. But first of all, there's a question from Emily saying, did you get additional external advice on best practices for dealing with the existing stone wall, or has this come from past experience and research?
Past experience and research, and also working with an incredibly talented stonemason. Who was, in his early 60s, had been doing it for a long time, and was a bit of a geek when it came down to working with stone walls, and was incredibly useful. It was a really collaborative approach. Like I said, the lime mortar mix was really important to the success of the scheme. So the number of samples we did with him to make sure that we achieved exactly what we wanted, both in terms of performance and aesthetics. And it was really useful having him as part of the team.
Right. You've possibly already partly answered this question from Jasper saying, did you find anything intriguing during the build on such a historical site? And you clearly talked about some of those more practical aspects of the Parchment works. But
yes, the water bath was obviously the most exciting find throughout the project. There were interesting bits, but I think that one was the most significant because, like I said, it's the very reason why the building exists where it exists. So it was a really humbling process to discover it and then have the opportunity to celebrate it so that it can be enjoyed for generations.
Right. And then we've got a few practical questions again about the fabric of the building. So Ada's asking, how much insulation did you have to install to the walls, the floor, and the roof?
So the walls we only installed insulation in parts, as I said, to make sure that we exposed the historic fabric of the building as much as we possibly could. The floor, we doubled up the amount of insulation you'd ordinarily do in a floor build-up, and similarly for the roofs, again to offset the fact.
Right. And then there's a question from Mika saying, what percentage of the build included reused materials which you found on the site? Did you quantify it, or is it more a case of it applies to particular aspects of the build?
We didn't quantify it, but to the point where we didn't actually buy in any new stonework or brickwork because we might.
Right. I think Will may have frozen. But if you can hear me, Will, that then leads on to a question from James. And I'm not sure whether you can answer it, but he just wonders what the construction value of the project ended up as, and did it differ to the original budget?
The construction.
I think Will's frozen. I don't know. Will, are you back with us?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Right. We couldn't make out the answer to that question on budget.
Right. Yeah. It was just under 250k for the overall project, which was relatively modest for what we achieved. But that was partly because of the fact that we reused a lot of stonework and material that we found on site. So the material cost was minimal.
Right. And then Jake asks, and it's partly to do with that, but what is the reaction from the client now they've lived in it for a few years?
Oh, they love it. I mean, the best thing about the project is I get to carry on visiting it as well and seeing them enjoy the space. And one of the sad things about being an architect is, well, particularly in domestic architecture, is you hand over the keys and you perhaps never see the building ever again. But in this instance, because it's a family home, I get the opportunity to come back and see how they use the space and enjoy the space, which is a really lovely thing to be a part of.
That's probably the perfect introduction to bring Tom back in. So we've actually got two architects who've actually had the great fortune to do very, very interesting reworkings of existing buildings and to carry on actually enjoying them and seeing how they're serving the family as the buildings settle in and the families get used to them. It'd be interesting to know. There was one question earlier on for you, Tom, about anything you would do differently. I'm not going to ask Will if you do anything differently, but is there anything that particularly intrigues either of you about the other's project? I mean, there's quite a lot of similarity in terms of reuse of materials, etc. So, Tom.
I've got a very practical question, actually. And you talked about the joy of working with a family client. But having worked for my own parents and having obviously done projects with Liz, it can be a difficult thing as well. And I'm very lucky. Liz is an architect. We can talk about things as architect to architect, and there's a certain language that we use. But I know working for my parents in the past, trying to differentiate between the kind of professional relationship and the family one, where they remember you as a small child, was always quite difficult. And how did you get on? Did you find the same or not?
Yeah, quite right. I mean, particularly my dad. So it was always a challenge. I mean, at first it was very difficult, I must admit, because my dad's not. He's done a lot of building work in the past. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why I'm an architect, because I've always lived on the building site. So he has a keen understanding of how buildings get put together. So I think it was very difficult for him to take advice from his son when he'd already done it before in the past. But I think they were just teething issues. Eventually, he got around to it, and I think this client took a lot of persuasion. But when I eventually persuaded them, they got on board and they started listening. And in the end, it was a really enjoyable process to be a part of. And I enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope they did too. And I think they have done, because I think they're enjoying the house and loving living in the house. I mean, from my point of view, I have a similar question to you, in that I've never designed a building for myself, and I don't know how you do that, because having a client allows you to formulate a brief and allows you to reduce your choices. I think I'd end up changing the design a million times if I was the client.
I think reducing your choices is a really good phrase, because let's face it, one of the hardest things to do is design when you've got a completely blank sheet.
Yeah.
I did that house up on the west coast of Scotland a few years ago, where it was just an amazing site with nothing on it, and knowing where to begin is really difficult. And actually, the brief can really help by ruling out some possibilities. I think here, Liz had strong opinions, and we had this process generally that I would be sketching on the train on the way home from work, and then she'd be critting it and saying what she thought worked and what she didn't. And that was really useful, because you can convince yourself that something's working, and then when someone actually describes it back to you, you can see the flaws.
So you had that critical process with your wife, effectively, which I think is key to the success of a building, because I believe every great building has a great client sat behind it. There's lots of talented architects out there, and I think a lot of architects just need good clients to realise their talents.
Absolutely agreed. It's got to be a collaboration with the client every time, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's always slightly difficult when it's your own family. But
agreed.
There is also the aspect in terms of, as architects, we actually have to be careful about the vocabulary we use with clients who may not come from an architectural or a construction background. But of course, there is the added benefit, or is it a problem, of actually having the shared frame of reference with the family. So actually you can articulate quite complex concepts by alluding to something that you might have shared in the past, rather than having to come to it with a kind of just explaining it from a first principles point of view.
I think that's a really good point, Denise. I mean, a lot of the work that we do, we try and develop relationships with our clients at an accelerated, unnatural pace, so that you understand exactly what they want out of their building. But one of the benefits of designing for a family member is that you develop that relationship, you understand their needs and their wants to some extent. So you've kind of, you're already halfway through tackling the issue already.
And a key point of the whole briefing process is accepting that the client certainly with an existing building that perhaps they've lived in before, they know that building far better than you do, but they don't necessarily know what they know. And it's that process of drawing out of them. And you say, well, sometimes it just takes time.
Yeah.
Drawing out of them and giving them a chance to tell you everything they actually know about that building that needs to be part of the brief.
Yeah, we've realised that the briefing process is the most important part of the design process, because a good quality brief realises a good quality building. And we spend a huge amount of time at that stage now, more so than we used to. It's something that we've learned over a 4-year existence.
Because I think what both projects have in common is the fact that they took the existing buildings, introduced a completely different quality of light into them. You know, what had been basically the kind of the solid wall overlooking the field in Stone Cottage, of course, now is kind of a full width glazed aperture, where the room feels so much bigger simply because it opens straight onto the field and off to the horizon. And then coming all the way through Parchment works, as you say, you come in the front door and you just have this incredibly interesting sequence of volumes where the quality of light is changing all the way through until eventually you get, again, a vista to landscape.
But that is reflecting the difference in the way in which we live in buildings and the technologies available to us, isn't it? You know, modernism was only possible because of central heating. And nowadays it's only possible because we can make well-insulated buildings that still allow. But you know how people are always drawn to the light. You know, if you have a modern extension or an old building, that's always where the people tend to go because of the light available. And it simply reflects what our expectations are now.
I mean, that being said, one of the nice things about the Parchment works is that you still have the cellular rooms of the old cottage. Lovely to retreat to in the winter, in a cold winter's evening. But then you have the 21st century modern day open plan living arrangements towards the rear that you spend most of your time in. So that's what's nice working with historic buildings and creating contemporary interventions. You get the best of both worlds, which I think is really nice.
It also gives the opportunity of having really quite interesting internal materiality, that actually you can have different ceilings, you can actually have the exposed structure, etc. Or as with Stone Cottage, you could actually just introduce a very kind of lovely curved feeling to the soffit.
And those textures are so important. If you remember, Denise, the plaster here, you know, just the grittiness of it, and trying to get that sensory richness can make such a big difference to spaces that are basically fairly simple.
I think materiality is so important. It's one of our watchwords. It's one of the best. You know, we try and achieve that rich material palette as much as we possibly can on all our projects.
Yeah. Right. Sorry. Oops. Sorry. Just some comments coming in. So just before we finish, there's a note from Anna in the audience. Saying it's just such a refreshment to hear stories of these two humble, down-to-ground individuals. I'm glad there are still those sentiments and attitudes which attracted me in the first place to the profession so many years ago. So thank you.
Very kind.
And I think we would all definitely agree with that. That's fantastic. I enjoyed today. I loved visiting both buildings. I look forward to seeing how they carry on serving the families well into the future. So with many, many thanks to our special guests, Will Gamble and Tom Miller. And hopefully we'll see you on other building stories in the future with award-winning projects.
Thank you very much.
Just to wind up, thank you to the audience. Thank you to everybody in the background keeping this kind of broadcast. Building Stories will be back next Tuesday lunchtime. Special guest is Clive England from Thomas Ford and Partners, and he's going to be sharing the story behind St John's Church in Hackney. The host is Joe McCafferty from Levitt Bernstein, and you can sign up for tickets by following the link in the chat. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and see you again. Bye.